First of all, I'd like to congratulate the authors on an excellent report. I think there are some very important messages in this report. It's a contribution to the growing body of literature on determinants of GVC participation, because it's the first time I've really seen the criticality of infrastructure quality in particular and capacity in infrastructure being highlighted so strongly as a determinant. And I think also the forward-looking element in this report about embedding green practices and bringing in digitalization in supply chains is also a very important message. The one part which I really took away was on the regional front, where it talks about the need to leverage regional cooperation and frameworks and to avoid protectionism and inward-looking policies to ensure resilience and agility in GVCs, so that you can spread the benefits more widely. I think this message couldn't come at a more critical juncture when there's so much uncertainty about how global supply chains are going to pan out following the pandemic, and the more insular or inward-looking sort of policies, including that of the Indian government in recent years, with customs duty hikes and calls for self-reliance. So I think on all these fronts, this report really does make very useful contributions. Now, the way I'd like to just structure my intervention is very quickly just talk about some of the main challenges that are constraining our participation. We saw, highlighted in the presentation how we have a pretty stagnant and low share in terms of GVC participation. And there are various reasons for this. As the report also highlights, we have a mix of backward and forward participation. But if you look at the kind of sectors that are there, many of them like coke and petroleum, largely, you could say that this is just basically importing products, refining them and exporting. We don't really see, even though there is a shift towards high technology manufactured products, we're moving more into specialty chemicals. We are talking about auto and auto components. But again, it's important to see where you are in the value chain within each of these industries as well. And I'll come back to this point because one of the interesting things, if you look at the noteworthy features of India's GVC participation, I'll take 4. India lags other emerging economies in GVC exports. Its GVC basket is not as diversified in terms of sectors and markets, though, as I said, there's a gradual shift towards high-tech products. Its forward participation is mainly in raw materials and lower value-added products and segments, though that's changing gradually. And its backward participation has grown over time in several industries due to increased reliance on imported parts and intermediates. Now, what we're seeing is that in many of these very emerging sort of sectors, we're not seeing sufficient domestic value-added content, and there are various reasons for that. I can come back to that. But what for me is interesting is actually the role of services. And you just mentioned this, that services may not play such an important role in terms of the scale of employment that they might generate and therefore the focus on manufacturing. But what's very interesting is that, India, though being highly competitive in services, the value-added contribution of services to our exports in manufacturing or in other countries' exports, so the embedded value is also not there. So basically, we are just a direct exporter of services. We're competitive, but we've not really integrated the service sector into the manufacturing value added. So for instance, if you look at the value added content from something like computer and related services manufacturing exports, it's very low. And bulk of it is used within the sector itself and within computer and related services. Similarly, if you take R&D and business services, if you're talking about moving up the value chain into more innovative and high-tech manufacturing exports, well, actually the contribution of R&D and business services within manufacturing exports is quite low, and it's been quite stagnant. In fact, it's actually declined. So again, what it raises some very interesting questions, because if in Make in India and so on, we're talking about increasing business sophistication, we're talking about increasing technological depth, we're not seeing the kind of integration of other sectors of the economy as part of the value chain, even domestically. So the kinds of questions that come to my mind is, why aren't we able to leverage IT? Why aren't we able to leverage R&D services more intensively in our manufacturing processes? Because these would have implications for efficiency, productivity, automation, and so on. It would actually enable us to play a bigger role in international production networks. So I'm really talking about servitization of manufacturing. That's the way I would see the services manufacturing link. Does it reflect on the nature of Indian manufacturing, which may be due to issues of scale, infrastructure, and regulatory hurdles, can't leverage these services? Does it reflect on the pattern of our manufacturing export basket, And might this change going forward with greater emphasis on high-tech manufacturing products like, specialty chemicals or auto components and so on? Similarly, if you look at the low contribution of R&D and business services, basically, this is noteworthy because we know that these play an efficiency enhancing role and they enhance competitiveness. So again, is this due to regulatory barriers and standards and quality related issues in these services? Or is it the nature of manufacturing itself? So I think we really, if we want to look forward and look at higher value integration into GVCs and raise the level of integration, we also have to make much better utilization of the areas where we are competitive, and we're not doing that. Somehow the sectors are working in silos. So overall, I think there is a scope to rebalance our GVC export basket by increasing forward participation in sectors such as transport equipment, pharmaceuticals, electrical equipment through increased domestic value-added content from both manufacturing and services. There are many other sectors that people have talked about. I won't go into that. I think it's more important to, at this juncture, to actually talk about some of the main challenges. And here, let me focus, since I know Rajiv will be talking about the infrastructure part. I think looking at the literature, we know what are the determinants of GVC participation, and trade and FDI policies are a very central part. So in the Indian context, I think I would just focus on 4 factors, which I believe are the main reasons why India has lagged behind other Asian economies. The first really is trade costs due to trade restrictions as well as cumbersome trade procedures. As production has become more fragmented across economies, GVC participation will require import and export transactions with many countries in different segments of the value chain. So high trade costs due to either high tariff or non-tariff measures will get passed on to downstream firms. That will raise the cost of finished goods, which will adversely affect production and investment decisions of firms in GVCs. Now, while India has seen a general decline in tariffs over the past 2 decades, still, compared to emerging economies outside South Asia, it has higher tariffs on average. OECD and World Bank still identify India as trade restrictive, and this is also true in the case of services. So in recent years, we've seen successive hikes in import duties on several products. And in fact, India stands second among the G20 countries in increasing production levels after the US in recent years. So this is certainly not a signal that you'd want to give for a country looking to integrate into GVCs. Apart from that, trade costs have also been affected by cumbersome customs procedures and weak and inadequate border infrastructure. GVC products are more vulnerable to such problems as they cross the border many times and costs rise cumulatively. So again, as with tariffs, though we've seen improvement in trade facilitation since 2014 in particular, there's reduced time, reduced cost in exporting and border compliance has improved also with digitalization and other trade facilitation measures. I think there's still a lot of scope. We're still not in the top 50. And in a study that I had done actually on trade facilitation, what we found is that a lot of this is still on paper. So basically on ground, the mindset hasn't changed. We're still looking at paper-based documents, not digital processes. There are a lot of problems with interagency coordination, especially when it comes to, looking at standards, testing facilities, implementation of a risk management system. So a lot more progress is needed on trade facilitation. In terms of the FDI part, I think there is also a challenge here as to why we are not able to increase our participation levels in GVCs. This is primarily because the nature of FDI that has come into India is largely domestic market focused. So although India has liberalized its FDI regime and it's emerged as one of the major recipients, it still actually ranks higher on the FDI restrictiveness indices that the OECD brings out, though it's more open than China and Indonesia. So a large part of these inflows, really, it's about the focus on the domestic market and the market-seeking type, not the efficiency-seeking type. Now, again, this is in part because of the large domestic market, but that's not the main reason. It's really because of the constraints that firms face when they want to use India as a base for exports to other markets. The constraints are many. We know these are about production standards, challenges to cross-border movement of goods and services, difficulties with accessing vital inputs like industrial land, skilled labor, infrastructure, and policy unpredictability, lack of confidence, basically, in regulatory assessment and policy stability. These are some of the challenges on the FDI front as to why the focus has been more domestic market-oriented and less export-oriented. Third, of course, reason for the constrained participation in GVCs is infrastructure. I won't go into this because I think the report goes at length into this, and I'm sure Dr. Lal will talk about it. The fourth one is on institutions. And again, transactions costs depend a lot on institutional quality, the legal system, transparency, policy stability, contract enforcement, taxes, and the overall regulatory climate. Again, there has been improvement, but again, India, though it fares better within countries in South Asia, but it doesn't do as well compared to other emerging markets. And in fact, in some areas, the gap has actually widened in recent years. So in particular on contract enforcement, taxes, and policy predictability, India doesn't do as well. So I would say of the four factors that I've mentioned, physical infrastructure and institutions are like the brick and mortar of GVCs, because they're also needed to underpin efficient trade and FDI flows, which in turn are the basis for GVC participation. So in a way, it's like an ecosystem. We've not had the right kinds of trade procedures or trade facilitation. We've had the wrong kind of FDI. I won't say wrong, but not the kind that facilitates GVC participation, and underpinned again by problems with infrastructure as well as institutional quality. Now, if we look at some of the recent
Rupa,
initiatives.
If I could just urge you to wind up. Yeah, no,
sure.
Please, this is, you put a lot of effort into this, but just to keep it on schedule. Thanks.
Yeah, so now you asked me the question about RCEP, right? I think personally, this was a lost opportunity, because if we want to, try and do everything ourselves, this is just not feasible. And I know the whole fear was really about being a party to an agreement that had China. With all the other countries, we are either negotiating or we already have an agreement. Now, this makes it even tougher because, RCEP would have given us the benefit of harmonizing, or at least trying for mutual recognition of standards. It would have enabled us to actually attract FDI from some of these partners, some of whom incidentally happen to be bilateral trade partners as well under bilateral agreements, but we've not been able to leverage those. So I think we really need to go back and review some of those agreements and see what is constraining increased engagement with these partners in terms of FDI flows, and how do we plug in through exports into this regional production network. So I think it is a lost opportunity, and it makes it even more important for us to look at other partners with whom we can get into GVCs, look at other MNCs. So we are looking at the West, but I think these are tougher ones, because you're going to come with increased standards in terms of environment, human rights, labor, and many other compliance issues, which would be hard to sign on at this time. So I'll end here. I think RCEP was a mistake to get out of.